Right, so we are now almost officially all urban economists. We've got our last session for the day. We're going to be talking about transforming African cities with Professor Ed Glaeser from the University of Harvard. If you do no other reading, because some people have told me they haven't done their readings for the course, but there is a non-academic reading that you might want to do, and that is Professor Glaeser's book called The Triumph of the City, that will tell you everything you need to know about why cities are so important.
As you've assuredly heard for the last day and a half, the large-scale urbanization of Africa is happening, and it creates both challenges and tremendous opportunities. I am certainly strongly associated with the view that there's more upside than downside, and with the view that the only pathway out of poverty to prosperity runs through city streets. But there are, of course, also demons that come with density. And dealing with the downsides of proximity is one of the central tasks, and in some sense, one of the great vocations of the 21st century. And so, you can see that Africa is joining the other continents and moving towards being an overwhelmingly urban country, or urban continent. And this is a figure that I think is helpful for understanding what's happened in the world. So this shows the share of countries by income group that is more than one-third urban in 1960 and today. And obviously, I've corrected for inflation. But if you look at the bars between 4 and 5,000, or between 3 and 4,000, you see there's roughly no change. Overwhelmingly, those countries were more than one-third urban in 1960, and overwhelmingly, they are more than one-third urban today. By contrast, if you go to the poorest countries on the group, let's say those earning less than $1,000 in per capita income, and you ask yourself, what share of those countries were more than one-third urban in 1960? It's a really easy number for you to remember. The number is 0. Because in 1960, as had been true throughout almost all of human history, to be poor was to be rural. Right? And this was sort of a fundamental fact, and that has fundamentally changed. And that is, in fact, this fundamental reshaping of the world that we are experiencing, right? Because today, more than 40% of those poorest countries are more than one-third urban. In between the 1 and 2000, we've gone from 20% to 60% are more than one-third urban. And so we see the rise of cities like Kinshasa or Karachi in places that are both poor and poorly governed. Now, that both creates enormous potential upside, because city streets create the possibility for economic transformation, they create the possibility for political organization, they create the possibility for civic culture, and yet they also create enormous difficulties, both because they can abet revolutions and because they can abet plagues, right? Both of these things go on in urban spaces. Now, what I'm going to be talking about in today's lecture is I'm going to start with a few general observations about cities. Then I'm going to extend in a lengthy riff about segregation. I mean, at their hearts, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. When people are segregated within cities, whether or not they're segregated at the workplace or at home, in some sense they lose the central benefit of urban connection, right? They can occupy a space that is as isolated as a rural village, even in an urban area. And so there's going to be a lengthy riff on this. I would urge you when we get beyond this opening materials, if there's stuff that you don't understand that I'm putting up on the page, feel free to stop me. But I'm going to stop and try and leave at least 15 minutes at the end for more general questions about cities and policy. And then I'm going to engage in a relatively awkward transition to talk about urban infrastructure, and in particular to talk about the maintenance of urban infrastructure, to highlight 2 new papers on this. Now, I will also before I plug in, mention 3 meta statements about urban policy that have guided me in advising urban leaders for at least 20 years. One of which is the best economic development strategy is often to attract and train smart people and then to get out of their way. Right? That's a very central role that, in fact, we think by and large urban economies are driven by human capital, as are all economies fundamentally. Secondly, right, governments need to focus on what they have to do and not do stuff they shouldn't do, right? And that's a central element in this. So embedded in the attract and train smart people and get out of their way is not a hidden agenda for laissez-faire, right? Attracting and training smart people requires a great deal of work. I mean, in part, it's about the sort of getting the human capital process working. In part, it's about attracting people, which requires safe streets, which requires functional traffic, which requires all of those basics of urban life that are essential if you're going to pull people in, and that requires a government. But on the other hand, governments also do things which are often counterproductive. They often regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor far more heavily than they regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich. Right? And we have situations in which, because we have benighted rules that say you can't have a workplace in a residential neighborhood, we have shebeens that are unregulated and sell poisonous materials, right? Which makes far less sense than a regulation light, which would say, by all means, open your establishment in your township, but we actually do have a rule that we're going to enforce that you can't sell poisonous liquor, or you can't sell poisonous groceries, right? And so we sort of have a much more limited role for government on this, but one that's actually focused on the negative externalities, not that's focused on artificially restricting people's freedom to do things. Last point, and this is a framework that I found helpful in many settings, but I came up with it here about 7 or 8 years ago in my first trip to Cape Town, which is it is often helpful for city governments to see themselves as having 2 layers. The lower level is a for-profit real estate company, right, that looks at assets like the harbor and says, this is where the money is going to come in. And we need to think about how we're going to develop this for-profit entity in a way that maximizes the amount of cash. But yet, that for-profit real estate company is owned by a not-for-profit poverty alleviation company, okay? And it's very helpful to think of these as 2 different layers, because you don't want to think that your downtown harborfront glossy tower that you're building for some purpose, right, which is mainly about earning property tax revenues or something else, also has to directly alleviate poverty. It doesn't. Right? It just needs to yield resources that you can then use to engage in whatever randomized controlled trial you want to use in Dunoon, right? And that's the sort of like the central divide that's really crucial. And I think cities often make a mistake if they try to combine the sort of poverty alleviation task with the profit maximization task. Okay. Now these are going to be opening observations, and I'm going to go very quickly through them. Perhaps the single sort of most awkward set of moments that I've had as an urbanist is, you meet some national government official who says, great, you're an urban economist. Tell me how I stop these poor people from coming to my city and screwing it up. Okay? And, you understand this, and there's a strong, healthy, anti-urban bias in American policymaking, and it often shows up in the developing world as well. I mean, it was Gandhi who, famously would say things like the future of India lies in its villages or how terrible cities were. The irony, of course, right, is that this is like the mature Gandhi, right, showing, embodying his philosophy of the world. This is Gandhi learning. Right? This is where Gandhi learned his stuff in South Africa cities, right? This is what made Gandhi Gandhi, not spinning, right? And so, in fact, it was the city itself that sort of made him, and yet he sort of had a view that sort of cities were not going to be a particularly important thing for the future of India, which was surely a mistake. We know this both from the cross-sectional correlation between urbanization and income. This is urbanization in 1960 and subsequent income growth across those countries with per capita incomes below $5,000 in 1960. Now, we're far from doing policy with growth regressions, right? This is not something we do anymore. But I can't look at this and think, oh boy, it's really crucial we stop urbanization. This is what we want to do. We want to make sure people don't come to cities, right? I certainly don't take away from this that I want to artificially urbanize, right? I tend to think that the best public policy perspective from the national level is to be spatially neutral. But you can't look at something like this and say, boy, it's just great if you can make sure that everyone remains on the farm. Second fact. So this is, I probably should update this. This is World Value Survey. Each one of these dots represents the difference in self-reported life satisfaction between urbanites and rural dwellers in each country. So it's just a happiness difference. In rich countries, there's basically no difference. Some places like New Zealand, the rural dwellers are happier. In other places like Sweden, the urban dwellers are happier. I mean, if you just contemplate what January must be like in rural Sweden, it's hard not to imagine being miserable. But if you go to the poorer parts of the world, there's a very big gap between urban and rural happiness, and it strongly favors cities. Okay? It strongly favors cities in Mali, Ghana, Moldova, Rwanda, Guatemala, South Africa. And of course, ironically, given Gandhi, the country with the largest urban-rural happiness gap is, of course, India itself. Okay? Iraq and Thailand are the 2 counterexamples. Iraq's cities were going through certain adverse negative shocks around 2007, and Thailand I blame on the traffic jams. Okay. Done with opening thoughts. We're now moving to sort of a more direct thing. First question that I'm going to pose to you, right, is are places like Dunoon, are townships, pathways out of poverty? Do they offer a way to get out, or are they poverty traps? Okay. Now, in order to answer this question, you need something like the ability to follow people over time, which is often very difficult. And I'll sort of give you 3 examples of this. One very nice paper on this looked at the cross-section. This is people living in Kibera. And this is Mark Stoker and Surrey, Journal of Economic Perspectives, 2013. And they find that the people who have lived longest in the slum are not any richer than the people who are new arrivals. In another graph that they have, actually, it's negative. The problem with this is obviously the selection bias, right? If you're still in a slum 30 years after being in the city, you're unlikely to have done well, but other people may have done well. This comes from a book by Janice Perlman called Favela, where she, in her youth, in 1969, did a survey of people living in the equivalent to a Brazilian township, a favela, and she did ethnographic work, she mapped out their lives, and then she came back 32 years later. Okay? The difference is just enormous. And so you can just see these are the original interviewees. This is the same people 32 years later. This is their children. This is their grandchildren. I mean, the thing which strikes me most is in 1969, 72% of the original interviewees were illiterate. Okay? 32 years later, that's down to 45%, and essentially none of their children or grandchildren are illiterate. Years of education went up from 2.5 to 7.4, and the share of people owning a car was 0 in 1969. That went up to 14%. The share owning an air conditioner had risen to 50%. And the share with a brick home or indoor plumbing has similarly gone up. The problem with this, which shows enormous progress, is there's no control group. Right? It's not like they're actually comparing it with a different group. Brazil got a lot richer over this time period, so again, it's not showing it either. You really need something that looks like a panel. So what we've done is to use a panel for Brazil, and I'm just going to give you a couple of facts about this. So our technique on this is exactly copying what De La Roca and Puga did in their Review of Economic Studies paper, which is an individual panel estimate which allows for individual fixed effects and then looks at the impact on both wage levels and wage growth of people who come to cities. Using panels to identify urban effects on wages was something I actually pioneered as a graduate student in 1991, and my paper on this was published in the Journal of Labor Economics in 2001. So it was called Learning in Cities, which is on measuring, Cities and Skills, which is on measuring the impact of cities. And what I found, sort of in my youth of doing this in the early 1990s, was that you didn't see, when people came to cities, you didn't see an immediate huge wage gain. What you saw is faster wage growth when they were in cities, which was compatible with Alfred Marshall's view that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. Okay, this view that cities are forges of human capital, places that we get smart by being around other smart people. Okay, so Puga and De La Roca do this better. They do this better partially because they have administrative data, and so they're able to look at lots of different people. They don't just estimate a big city effect and a small city effect, which is what we were constrained to do with the non-administrative data sets. For each city, they estimate a separate level effect and a separate slope. Okay, so we do this for Brazil. Now, Brazil is probably the poorest country that you would be willing to do this with, because Brazil has a significant share of people who are informal, nowhere near as big as in South Africa, but that share that's informal makes it difficult to use administrative data. Among the younger Brazilians who will be the focus of our work, maybe 80% of them are formal, something like that. So it's not the same sort of 80% informal, which would make it just totally unusable in many parts of the world. These are the different locations that we have. These are the microregions across Brazil, and each one of these is a different place that we will estimate a treatment effect for. To try to deal with the issue of informality slightly, we're able to use 2 data sets, the PNADC and the PME, which contain both formal and informal workers. The larger one is the PNADC, which is something like a census. And there we don't have a panel, so the selection issues are real, but we can estimate the interaction between age and city size, which is the poor man's way of estimating whether or not there's sort of more learning in cities. So this is asking, do you see a larger age earnings growth in bigger cities than in smaller cities? And the answer is not only do you, and that's shown in regressions 1, 3, 5, and 7, which is all shown in 2, 4, 6, and 8, right? This is all in this interaction. But the thing I really want to highlight is the gap between 2 and 4, or 6 and 8. 2 contains all the workers. 4 contains just the formal workers. Okay, the slope is flatter for the formal workers than it is for all workers. So throwing in the informal workers doesn't make things, doesn't cause things to disappear. And the same thing is more or less true with the PME. So again, I'm not sure that I believe this because, again, you have the selection of who remains in the cities. This is not done with individual fixed effects, but it makes me at least somewhat comfortable that the selection into formality isn't causing huge problems with the age earnings gap with cities. So what we do is we use the race data. This is tax data fundamentally. People are matched to firms. This is just the sort of estimates exactly doing what De La Rocca and Puga do. And if you run a whole bunch of sort of things, grouping some cities together exactly as they did. And we end up with a city size coefficient of 0.024 initially. So this is, as you double city size, you get 0.024 log points, or 2.5% roughly, initially. And that rises to 3% after 7.7 years. Since we are particularly interested in whether or not cities are working for poorer people, we restrict our sample to those people who are poor at the beginning of the data set, who are earning very little. And for them, the coefficient is 0.02 initially, and it's 0.039 later on. So if anything, the sort of gap between medium and larger is bigger for those workers than outside. So that's the first thing that we did. But we then started looking more cities, and we found what we thought was a really fascinating fact, which is the enormous gulf between northern and southern Brazilian cities. So you can see that in the first graph, where you're looking at this as just the initial city effect on city size. And the cities in red, which are on top, are the southern cities, which are the ones that are farther from the equator, the ones that are typically wealthier, enormously wealthier in many places. And the other ones, the blue ones, are the northern cities. These are poorer cities. These are more industrially simple cities. And we tried to understand what explains the difference. And it turned out that in a purely correlational sense, one variable was incredibly effective at explaining this, which is the degree of mixing of different workers at the establishment level. So this is just exposure of low skilled to high skilled within company at the micro-region level. And so what we found was that the relative segregation of northern establishments appeared to be, at least in a correlational sense, explaining the gap. And so that's in some sense leading to sort of the theme of what's about to follow, is understanding segregation in cities, and not just segregation of where people live at night, but segregation of where people work. With this idea that sort of, how would you move from being poor to being rich if you aren't actually exposed to people who have skills that you can borrow from, that you can learn from? And in some sense, that's the hypothesis that this is pushing to. We thought of this hypothesis being exactly, there was a model that was associated with the work that I did in the 1990s on this, which was the Learning in Cities model, where people bounce into people, and if you bounce into people who know more than you do, with some probability you move up a skill level. And so that predicts that if you're around skilled people, you are more likely to become skilled. And so we tested this here, and this is what we found. We then moved to the US because I've got better data in the US. I've got the complete, lots and lots of stuff for 20 years of looking at establishments. And the first fact I'll just give you is that segregation by skill at the establishment level has gone up over time. So this is the dissimilarity measure. This is a standard measure of segregation, which measures the share of either of the two groups that needs to be moved to get an even distribution across whatever your geographic unit is. So this tells you that 55% of workers, either moving the less skilled or moving the more skilled, 55% of them would need to be moved in order for there to be a flat distribution of skilled and unskilled workers across establishments. Now, what we tried to do with this is to sort of create things that looked like they were natural experiments in terms of the skill share. And what we did is we used mass movings. You can read a little bit of this in, there's an AEA Papers and Proceedings that I did with Frankie Dillon and Bill Kerr that describes some of the preliminary work on this. But the shocks are still in work. But the idea for the shocks, this just shows you across industries, the difference for non-college workers in wage growth between 2000 and 2019 by being in an establishment with above average skills versus below average skills. And in all of them, it's positive. Some of them are really large. So protective service appears to be sort of one of the largest gaps. That's being like a bodyguard or a security guard. And so that seems to have a particularly large gap between being around skilled people or unskilled people. So we have a variety of natural experiments that we tried to exploit. None of them is perfect. But so I want to focus first on these three down here, and then I'll say a little bit about this one. So these are coming from large shocks, of employment. So we see a significant number of workers get moved from one establishment into another establishment. And so we don't think that movement is because of something particular to an individual worker. And it does cause the composition of the establishments to change. And so we have both the movers design and the stayers design. So what the movers design says is there was a large move, there was a mass move, and you were part of that move. And so for you, either you moved up in terms of human capital, so your new peers are more skilled than your old peers were, or you moved down. And what we're showing essentially is after 10 years for the movers, the difference between the positive shock, moved up, versus the negative shock. Okay, we can do the same thing for stayers. And the stayers are the people who are just sitting there, and they have some group of people dumped on them, and they either increase their peers or decrease their peers. Again, roughly the same effect. The block level is, I had a move, but it wasn't in my company. It was just in my block. And so there was some large-scale move of people who moved into the same locale, and again, you see roughly the same size of effect between the top and the bottom. The last is, I think, the most dubious, which is you were liquidated. Okay, your firm closed entirely, and then you move to wherever you went next. Now, wherever you went next is probably the least random of this, which is why you probably get the largest effects. But all of them sort of show the same things in terms of the sort of large shock to who your peers are impacting who you have around, impacting outcomes. Okay. Divergence, still on the sharing and connection. I'm going to return to segregation in a second, but I want to specifically talk about sort of the ability of workers to benefit from interactions with each other. And this is work with Nava Ashraf and Alexia Delfino on trust and female entrepreneurship in Zambia. And the core idea in this is mass urbanization is proceeding quickly and in places with limited rule of law and weak states. The benefits of urban interaction are limited by our ability to work collectively and to trust one another, okay? Which tells you that rule of law and urbanization are complements, which is why the first law codes that we see are associated with urbanization in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. Okay, so all of this stuff has nothing to do with gender, nothing particularly to do with Africa. The point number 3 is a claim that women may be disproportionately at risk from male expropriation. Okay, and this comes out after 20 years of ethnographic work done by Nava with female entrepreneurs in Zambia. And she asks many of them, why don't you partner more? And we'll show you data on that in a second. And they say, when we do, the men often do bad stuff. Right? And you can imagine what that bad stuff is. Sometimes it involves stealing, sometimes it involves other things other than that. And so consequently, they're less likely to engage in these interactions. Okay, so and this both relates to the threat of violence. Courts may also be biased against women. And because it's more difficult for women to actually partner in urban markets and urban settings, the benefits of urbanization become lower. Okay, so just show you a little bit of cross-country stuff. So there's the places that have the highest levels of female entrepreneurship, and so those are the red dots, and this is using the World Bank Enterprise Survey, are those places that both have relatively little discrimination within the family, and this comes from the SIGI score, and relatively high rule of law. And so this tells you that in order to have female entrepreneurship, the things that the model says kind of matter are both you sort of need less discrimination, but you also need relatively strong protection, which enables you to make contracts and make deals. Across countries, you also get an inverted U in the relationship between GDP per capita and female entrepreneurship, which is exactly the opposite of the U-shaped relationship between female labor force participation and income. So in fact, it's middle-income countries that have the lowest rates of female labor force participation and the highest rates of female entrepreneurship. We have a model that explains this, which has 2 gender differences, but you need only 1, right? You need some sort of tax on female entrepreneurship, which could be that she's just required to do more stuff in the household. She's required to take care of the kids. She's required to take care of her husband. She's required to take care of her sick parents. Or it could be that women face discrimination from employees. So this is, again, this idea that the employees aren't as respectful or they aren't as hardworking. I don't need both of them. I threw them both out because I wanted to claim both ideas because I think both are real, but either one of them drives my model. Okay, and the way that this relates to getting the U-shaped is and I want you to think about what's happening across incomes is just the general productivity of being an entrepreneur is going up. So as you go from poor to rich, you get more from being an entrepreneur. At low levels, it's just sort of a straight tax, and it keeps women out of being entrepreneurs. And then sort of gradually, as the country gets richer, women get brought in. So that's the first part. But then after a certain level, you get a transition into a more complex form of business, and the men transition first. okay? Because the sort of business of running a larger enterprise, either because you're dealing with your kids or because you're dealing with pain in the neck employees, it keeps you with a simple firm rather than a complex firm. And so that's exactly what you get in this graph. So these are male profits as the level of development goes up. You can see it sort of moving along normally, and then it switches into being a complex firm here. Women switch somewhat later. Okay, and during this particular thing, when the men are switching to complex firms and the women are not yet, you see the ratio of female to male entrepreneurs going down. Okay, and so it's this world in which you sort of have both an original entry and the complexity that gives you the inverted U. And just to sort of show, that there's some factual stuff behind this, we have a number of facts, and this is again in the AEA papers and proceedings from this year. The share of women running tiny firms is just much, much larger than the share of men doing it, and that's true at actually all levels of development. Okay, women in trust in Zambia. So Nava and her co-authors have put together the census of businesses in Lusaka, and we know where all the people are, and some of the people are in markets. I'll show you just an image of markets in a second. So these are markets in Lusaka, right? They will typically have a chief, and they will typically have a specialization. Okay, something like you can see this is a clothes market. This one appears to be about making wood-related products. I don't know what this one is, but it's some kind of a market. And the census asked a lot of questions, and I'll just show you some of the ways in which women are different from men. First of all, women are specialized in a very small number of industries. And in fact, many of the returns to female entrepreneurship can be explained just by this industrial specialization. Above all, women are specialized in apparel. So that's making clothes. And then after that, there's making food. Now, on a first pass, this could be explained by lots of things, like traditional skills, which are good in making apparel and making food. They don't need to be something else. And then they're much lower in other areas. But we also notice other patterns which are compatible with a view that trust and sharing matters. So these are all different questions that we asked about activities that you do with other businesses. Okay, and the pinker thing is women, the bluer thing is men. And in all the other industries other than apparel, on every form of trusting behavior, there is a gap in which the men are doing more cooperative behavior than the women are. The men are doing more, getting more advice, they're doing more lending, they're doing more joint buying, they're sharing more orders. And so there's a significant gap. That disappears in apparel. Which is at least compatible with the view that one of the reasons you specialize in an industry like apparel is that you can work with other women, you can sell to other women, you can buy from other women, and you don't have to deal with the pain in the neck men. Okay, and this is my single favorite graph on this, which shows you that I often think that simple facts are much more interesting than highly identified regressions or even structural models. But as I mentioned earlier, this quotation from Alfred Marshall, and you see this going on with the men. Okay, so who taught you how to do this job? Essentially 3/4 of them are learning from other entrepreneurs, whether or not they're in the same business or the same family or in a slightly different industry, but they're learning on the street, right? The mysteries of the trade are becoming no mystery and are being in the air. Where are the majority of women learning from? Formal training. They're paying to get skilled. They're not putting themselves as an apprentice to an older male entrepreneur who's going to teach them for perhaps obvious reasons. And so they have to pay a cost, and they're not getting the same benefits of urban lending. Now, we now have two experiments for helping us look at why this might be. The first of which is just looking at what happens in markets versus outside markets. And so one of the key elements to markets is markets have chiefs. The chiefs administer justice. So if you have engaged in a joint purchase thing and your partner has not done it, right? You go to the chief and you say, "Chief, make this guy do this job." And the chief will actually do what an American court will not, which is called enforcing specific performance. So in American court of law, actually, if you do something jointly, the judge will actually say if you fail to deliver, the judge will assign you damages, right? You will have to pay, but the judge will not sit over the guy and say, you got to do it. Whereas in a Zambian market, the judge will say, you're doing it now or you're leaving the market, or something else bad will happen to you, okay? Which is a fairly efficient system. And you can see that in outside markets, there's less trust for everybody, and there's especially less trust for women, okay? In markets where women are less than 40%, the men trust slightly more, but the gap has diminished. In markets where women are more than 50%, the women trust us more than men do. Okay, and so it completely disappears when you've got a market mechanism. Now, we try to run a trust game. Now, these trust games have been going on, I think it's, first one was McCabe. I read a paper called Measuring Trust in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in maybe 2000, where the first stage is someone sends over money, then it's doubled or tripled depending upon the design, and then the second stage, the recipient sends the money back. We twisted this by giving the sender access to a market chief. And we actually used real market chiefs, and we said, if you have a problem with what the sender, what the recipient sent you back, just complain to the chief, and the chief will do whatever the chief will do. And we found that giving people access to the chief, completely eradicated without the chief, men are trusting more than women. With the chief, women are trusting more than men. Okay? So it's sort of exactly what we saw in the real world setting. Now, one thing that we thought was important was that we made the gender anonymous. And we were sort of following the work of my colleague Claudia Golden and Cecilia Rouse, who look at sort of the impact of having random judges in orchestra tryouts, and we thought that was some other good. We've now followed this up, and actually it turns out the women actually want their gender to be known by the chiefs. Okay, so there's heterogeneity across chiefs. There are some chiefs who are, in our 10 chiefs, there are, I think, 2 chiefs who the women don't want themselves to be known, but to the other 8, they all say, when they're given an option, they all say, tell the chief that I'm a woman. Okay, and those chiefs, they actually get it right. The chiefs who actually are, who they want to know, do have behaviors that seem to favor women in different ways. And that's compatible with the traditional roles of chiefs in Zambian society, which is they protect the weak. Right, that's their job. In fact, the strong actually don't need institutions of law to protect them. They've got their own means of doing so. The weak need them, and there's a strong tradition of chiefs actually protecting the more vulnerable in society. Okay, and this is the larger returns in our trust game that were experienced by women when they had a chief versus not. And so they're getting more money because they're sending more money and they're getting more back. Okay, done with Zambian markets. Actually, before I move on, does anyone have any questions on this game itself? There's like, I urge you to read the first paper, more stuff. We're revising it right now for the Journal of Political Economy, and we're putting work in this. Does anyone have any sort of explanatory questions? I don't want to go deep on like general questions on trust, but is there anything on this before? Because it'll be weird to go back to this. Okay, we can talk more about trust later, and female entrepreneurship, but okay, let me move on. Okay, next fact. I'm going back to segregation, and I'm going to try to get through the segregation stuff in the next 10 minutes, and then we'll spend 20 minutes doing infrastructure, and then we'll do the rest on Q&A. Okay, fact. Over here, positive relationship between population density across metropolitan areas and per capita GDP. Classic agglomeration, in fact, true in every country that we know. Other side. Upward mobility, as measured by Raj Chetty's Opportunity Index data. So here he takes people born around 1980. He looks at children whose fathers were poorer than 3/4 of the fathers, or whose families were poorer than 3/4 of the families in 1980. And then he asks, where do they end up 35 years later as adults in the income distribution? And so what this tells you is that in low density, 25th percentile people end up in the 45th percentile. In high densities, they end up in the 40th percentile. And so you can see there's sort of a straight negative thing. The denser the metropolitan area, the worse you end up. This is also true within metropolitan areas. The denser the neighborhood, the lower the upward mobility. This is true with people who are living more centrally versus less centrally. And it's particularly true if you compare just people inside versus outside of big city school districts. Okay, my hypothesis for this gap, okay, when at least I interpret this gap as sort of suggesting that cities seem to be kind of good for adults, and you saw this with the Brazilian workers who came to cities. We saw this earlier with the American workers. We saw this with the Spanish workers, but bad for kids. And so what hypothesis can potentially explain this? And one thought that I had was that if you think that most of these adults are coming to work in relatively integrated firms, their lives may be very different from their children. So if you wake up in a segregated community in Chicago or New York or Cape Town, many of those people will come and work in firms where there are lots of people from lots of areas around. By contrast, if you're a kid growing up in that area, you're playing in segregated streets, you're going to a segregated school, if you're going to school at all, and you're experiencing a highly isolated neighborhood. And this pushed me to the view that maybe we could test whether or not kids are leading much more segregated lives than adults. And again, this is part of moving beyond measuring just segregation of location. So we have roughly 60 years of measuring the segregation of how people live, mostly by race in the US, but also by income and education. So these are from 2 papers of mine from the mid-1990s, one of which is showing the rising segregation across America's cities between 1890 and 1950, the flattening between 1950 and 1970, and the decline in segregation in the US since the 1970s, which has been going on for the next 30 years as well. And this is from the other one shows the sort of just difference in difference between African American outcomes in highly segregated and less segregated cities, and the outcomes in highly segregated places are much worse, right? So there's a general fact that segregation appears to be associated with bad outcomes, and this, of course, is vindicated by the moving to opportunity experiments that were done, giving people vouchers and inducing them to move to lower poverty areas. But this is all about segregation of where you live, not segregation of how you live. And so I tried to do this with Cody Cook, who's just a whiz with this stuff, and Lindsay Currier, where we tried to use cell phones to measure experience segregation. We're following the work of Susan Athey and Matt Jenskow on this. And we were trying to identify kids versus adults. But the problem with kids versus adults is you don't know who's a kid. And not only that, the cell phone data is limited that you have no one under the age of 16 whose cell phone records you're being given. So I've got 16-year-olds and then up. I then identify kids by saying, do you spend the majority of your weekdays in a school? Okay, so presumably those are 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, but presumably it's also you're a teacher, you're a janitor, you're a staff member, and so I'm getting a very mixed bag about who's there. Even there is the experience racial isolation is higher for the student sample than for the adult sample. Income isolation, the gap is somewhat smaller, but it's not huge. It's not the kind of level where you say, boy, this explains everything. And I think part of the issue is it's just difficult to identify the kids. Now, what I was really excited by in this paper is that it turns out we can actually match the cell phone to the value of the home. And so what this paper ended up being about, although it was motivated by looking at kids versus adults, is it tells you how poorer and richer people experience the city differently. And again, this is the US. I'd love to see this for Africa. But this is, looking at household income. Household income means the value of the home. So we think of this as permanent income. This is how far the time that you share at your primary neighborhood. And you can see the wealthier the home, the wealthier the household, the less time you spend at home. The wealthier the household, the more places you visit. The distance from home is actually kind of non-monotonic. But this is the really striking one. And over here, this one has just metropolitan area fixed effects. So this one will include the impact of income on neighborhood. This one has tract fixed effects, which are essentially neighborhoods. And so this is saying, how do the people who live in rich houses, how does their lives differ from the people who live in poor houses within the same neighborhood? And the striking fact is not that, you look over here, going to more retail or restaurant. Obviously, richer people are going to go to more retail or restaurants. But what about parks? These parks are all free. Okay, and yet the people who are rich are going to more parks than the people who are poor. Okay, and you can say, well, yeah, but they're living in neighborhoods that have better parks. Sure, that's why it goes up more. You see, park is over here and it's over here. The impact is much lower, but they're still going to 20% more parks if they're in the richer house than if they're the poorer house, holding neighborhood constant. And that's kind of a striking fact to me. And it really tells you that the sort of income level or the sort of socioeconomic background of the parents really influence how much the person experiences the city, even holding neighborhood constant, which I think only serves to make this point that sort of, experience segregation is, daytime segregation is at least as important as the segregation that we've traditionally measured, which is who are your neighbors like? And I think it's a really important topic for things going forward. This is in this presentation just because I think it's cool, okay? And it's also about using measurement and seeing how people use cities. A guy called Holly White, William White, was an editor at Forbes in the 1950s, Fortune, forgive me. And one of the people that he discovered was this young observer of urban life. She was a housewife. She wasn't trained. She didn't finish college. But he gave her a platform and eventually got her a book contract. Her name was Jane Jacobs. And if there's sort of one name that you should know about sort of urbanism, it's Jane Jacobs, and you should read Death and Life of Great American Cities. Holly White then got involved after the 1961 zoning reform in New York, which created bonuses for creating setbacks. So if you look at New York buildings, those that are following the 1916 code look like ziggurats because the rule was you just had to have less and less light blocked out. The buildings that were built after 1961 have plazas in front of them. This was motivated in part because the original plaza building, which was the Mies van der Rohe designed Zekrom building, was seen as being a tremendous success. Holly White then took it upon himself to try to understand how people use these plazas, and he made many, many movies. And the movies then led to a book called The City, and it's a great book, and it involved a huge amount of time looking at this stuff. But we decided, let's be social scientists about this, and let's measure how people use cities in these movies by using AI. right, by using machine learning. And so that's what we did for this. Joint with Carlo Ratti, Ariana Salazar-Miranda, and so forth. We took the movies in 1980, we took movies that were made around 2010, and we tried to measure stuff from it. And so, for example, we measure how fast people are moving in these movies, okay? And so you can see between 1980 and 2010, people are moving a lot faster now than they used to be, and there are differences across areas. The speed variation has also gone up. We noticed that people are lingering left, so this is how many people are just staying in there for a certain amount of seconds. That's gone way down. It's particularly gone down in downtown Crossing, which is now used to be a place in which like people kind of hung out, and now people are just going down to the subway from downtown Crossing. There's less of a change at the stairs of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and much less in Bryant Park. This is people forming up groups across different locations. So 1980 and 2010 look the same for all locations, but you can see there are differences. So Bryant Park, there are many more dyads, many more joint groups than there used to be in the past, in part because Bryant Park used to be a haven for drug sales, and now it's kind of safe and nice. By contrast, downtown Crossing used to have guys hanging out there, and now it's done. Okay. That's movies, and it's a technology, and it's fun. And so I think this whole use of sort of new technologies to understand how urban space is used is just really exciting. And I can imagine, you saw Nick's work on sort of modal choice on thinking about public transportation. It is also interesting to think about modal choice with just what routes people take as pedestrians. Right? And in some sense, that can give you a way of understanding how much people like one block versus like another block and things like that. So this technology gives us a huge ability to understand how cities work. Okay, last 20 minutes. Infrastructure. Infrastructure is deeply fascinating and much more important from a policy perspective than most of what I've been telling you. So I find it endlessly fascinating how cities work to enable people to learn from people around them and to sort of find their future, and how peers work and how the people around us shape who we are. But in fact, all of our literature on segregation over the last 50 years has had at best a minimal impact on public policy. By contrast, the very little amount that we've done on transportation infrastructure, can immediately impact billions, right? And so, a series that one does pointing out the potential downsides of high-speed rail in America, right, can cause $10 billion less to be spent on this. And it's sort of, the largest impact of sort of anything we do as economists is often on these sort of technocratic kind of things. Now, this is just to get us motivated. This is the path of death rates in New York City. And sort of they go up over the early 19th century, they go down. When I was a kid growing up in New York, I was raised on a story of engineering triumphalism, that New York had been a fetid, terrible place until the great engineers brought in the aqueduct, which brought in the clean waters. They had sewers that brought out the fetid waters, and all of a sudden New York got healthy. But this graph immediately belies that, because you can see the aqueduct was opened in 1842, and for 25 years later, people are continuing to die of cholera. Right? They're continuing to die because of a last mile problem, because they build a few thousand hydrants in New York, which are free, but water is heavy to carry. It requires a significant price to connect, and poor people continue to use their pit latrines and their shallow wells, just as they do in Lusaka, where I work on water, and they continue to die. Okay, and anyone who didn't know, the last mile problem, which seems to have hit many of our development agencies as being a big shock, right, should have been well known to anyone who knew anything about New York City history, right, because this was a big part of the past of our city. My great grandfather died in that 1849 cholera epidemic 7 years after the aqueduct was open. It only changes after the Board of Health is instituted, and what the Board of Health does is it imposes penalties on tenement owners, on landlords who don't connect. And so you have essentially a Pigouvian tax that it's imposed that actually involves connecting people, and then you see the death rates go down. Now, in the developing world, there often are sort of two technologies that coexist. Right? One technology that emerges out of the global south, that's sort of a poor world technology. It's cheap, it's flexible, it's often unsafe. And a second technology, which is a rich world technology. It's glossy, it's fast, it's beautiful, it's ungodly expensive, and it's not a thing that sort of works for ordinary people. And when you look at these sort of two technologies, of course, I have the Caltrain and I have the minibuses in Johannesburg as being one classic example of this. The question is, when is the right thing to say, you want this technology to be everywhere, and when is the right technology that says, no, in fact, this is the sensible technology, I just want to make it safer? Okay, I just want to make it better. And that's sort of a standard frame you should always take when you think about infrastructure issues. These are the two technologies when it comes to housing, right? And when is the question when you want something that looks like this, large-scale, high-rise public housing, or when is it that you want to make the shacks look better? When you want the shacks to be a little bit safer, when you want to give them fiber, better action to water. And I don't mean to suggest that there's always a right answer. I think almost assuredly the right answer most of the time is to improve the minibuses and transportation to figure out how to make them safer. In terms of water and sanitation, I kind of like pipes. But again, you want to sort of do this on a serious cost-benefit analysis on a case-by-case basis. You don't want to make a claim that there's one answer in all cases. Once you've built whatever infrastructure you have, then you have the problem of actually maintaining it. And sort of maintenance is one of the sort of critical and hardest issues. Frequently, you'll see things like the World Bank will tell you that 90% of residents of this city have access to water, and yet they don't have access to water a lot of the time. Okay, so this is a Zambian. This is Zambian water. This is Zambian hygiene. And this is our data from Lusaka Water and Sewage of the average number of days per week without water. Okay, and so there are neighborhoods which have between 2 and 3.5 days of non-water every week. And keep in mind, the water, even in the best of circumstances, was only daytime. Okay, there was no water at night in any of these places. They're getting water only during the day. We tried to look at the impact of what happens when the water goes out. And what we did is we used the fact that water breaks are kind of random. And we had these complaints of water going out. We knew exactly where they were coming from. And our identification strategy relies on the idea that, like, this is not a viable comparison group with this. We can't just compare places. We need to compare what happens immediately after the water breaks here and compare it to a comparable place that had the water break 3 months later. And so we're using the randomness of when the water breaks to identify things. We identified from this 4 facts. When the water breaks, there are more waterborne illnesses. Unsurprisingly. When the water breaks, there are more respiratory illnesses. That was more surprising to us at the time. 2 hypotheses for this, one of which is that your body is sick from the waterborne illness, so you're more vulnerable to the other illness. The other hypothesis is, like, as we all remember during COVID, what else do you do with water? You wash your hands. And it may be that, in fact, you're not washing your hands, and that's contributing to this. 3, and this one's I've only got cross-sectional data, so I'm not sure how much I believe this, but it sort of feels so right to me that we included it in. When the water breaks, young women spend more time doing chores and less time studying. And finally, and this is my favorite fact, this is my equivalent to, like, where do you learn your skill in this one, is there's a very strong correlation between how people pay for the water and how quickly the water pipes get fixed. When the people pay by the liter, when they pay by volume, the pipes get fixed quickly. When they pay a fixed fee per month, they get fixed much more slowly. And so the incentives really matter in terms of determining the behavior of the water company, unsurprisingly. So this is the non-bloody diarrhea. In fact, this was published in Economica about 5 years ago, I think. Non-bloody diarrhea, typhoid fever, again, waterborne illnesses going up. This is respiratory infections and measles, again, non-water. Going up. Some of these things hit the young more, some of them hit the old more. This is our women are doing chores more, they're doing less hours of school or homework, but again, marginally significant even in the chores thing. And I think this is something that's best seen as being an interesting topic for future research rather than something that I'm confident about. And this is the last fact. This is not like open to debate, right? Days of supply issues and percent metered connections. So, like, all percent metered connections are really negative on sort of everything that you've got here. And so the communities that are paying by the month just are getting much less water as a result of how they're paying for it. And so it should always remind you that when you think about infrastructure, you have to think about infrastructure and institutions and incentives at the same point in time. It's never just about the physical infrastructure. Last point about maintenance. Roads and road roughness. Now, you've seen Gabriel Kreindler. The work that I'm going to give is joint with him and joint with Lindsay Currier. It's motivated by this earlier work by Ram Singh, who looks at PPP roads, so these are private sector roads, and non-PPP roads in India. The PPP roads and the non-PPP roads are sort of on the same length of road. It's not like in the US you have a separate private road that goes one distance and there's some other road. If you take a road from Delhi to Agra to see the Taj Mahal, you'll be for 5 kilometers on a public road and then you'll be for 5 kilometers on a PPP road, and you won't know the difference. You're just driving straight on. So it's really a fair comparison. And you see this huge difference in the bumpiness of the roads on the PPP roads, which are smooth, and the public roads, which are bumpy. Now, the normal theory of why PPP roads should be smoother than non-PPP roads doesn't apply here. And that theory is Eduardo Engel and his co-authors' work, which is when PPPs are paid for by tolls, then they have an incentive to keep the roads to be smooth, so they attract users. Okay, that's not what's going on here. These are not toll paid for roads. These are just roads that the government pays the PPP to provide. And yet still they are a lot smoother. The reason they're a lot smoother is they don't screw up the initial procurement stage. When you say it's a government road, but governments typically don't build the roads themselves. They hire someone else to make the road for them. And the PPP knows how not to get screwed in the first stage procurement better than the government does. The government hires crappy contractors. The stuff gets bad. I am not going to, in the 10 minutes we have remaining, dose you in my whole sort of like procurement is the greatest topic in the world and you should be thinking about public procurement. But I kind of believe that. That's 15% of global GDP is on public procurement and is radically understudied. And it is an incredibly important topic in every country in the world. And so I just throw that out. And this is an example of how things go wrong. My work with Gabriel and Lindsay is on road quality in the US. Now, we have had measures of road quality for our highways since the early 1990s. And the way we have road quality measures is that the Department of Transportation does essentially what ROM does. He sends out trucks at night at 50 miles per hour, okay? And they have things that measure how bumpy it is in the car, how much the vibrations are. And so that's relatively straightforward. And they do this for highways. And so you can see that this is a different measure. This is the American Society of Civil Engineers, which gives America's highways grades. And they gave us a B- in the 1980s, and they've been giving us like Fs since the 1990s. Now, the weird thing is, it's not weird. They're doing exactly what you would expect an interested industry group to do, that they've been saying our highways have gotten much worse by these measures. But in fact, the measures of smoothness show that they've actually gotten much smoother. And that's what you're seeing over there, that the highways have gotten much smoother over time. But at least in my daily commute, the problem is not the highways, which are typically smooth. The problem is the roads when you leave the highway. And this is not just particularly a US problem. Economists for most of the past 60 years, since the age of Bill Vickery coming up with congestion pricing, have had sort of one recipe to make our roads more effective, which is congestion pricing. We charge people for the Pigouvian externality of slowing down other drivers, and thereby we get less usage of the roads, and thereby we get the roads to move more quickly. What we have learned in the past 8 years, and some of this is due to Gabriel Kreindler's doctoral dissertation, to his thesis, some of it is the work of Gilles Duranton using Google speeds at night, is that in fact, developing world roads are often slow just because they're crappy, just because the roads are in terrible disrepair. Okay, and slowing down the congestion doesn't do very much if people would be driving at 20 miles per hour on the road, even if it's uncongested because the road is so broken up. And so the work that I'm going to be doing is US work, but I think it's relevant everywhere that roads are problematic. Now, we've had trucks that have gone out and done this for 40 years, but we haven't done on the local roads in the US because the national government in the US doesn't fund local roads. Local governments fund local roads. Now, luckily, because a former student of mine is the chief economist at Uber, he was kind enough to give me a month's worth of complete Uber data for the United States. We now have the Uber drivers' bumpiness measures. So all of our phones, right, have these accelerometers, which measure how much things go up and down. The nice engineers at Uber have a way of sort of dealing with a variety of technical issues on this. And we then are able to match these Uber drives to individual roads by using OpenStreetMaps. And so everywhere where Uber drives, we have measures of how bumpy things are. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than just sort of taking an average bumpiness, because different cars are going to have different levels of natural bumpiness speeds, different times of day might be different. And so we estimate for every road segment, okay, we're estimating a road segment specific intercept, a road segment specific slope, and then we've got driver fixed effects and date fixed effects and hour fixed effects. And so we saturate the rest of the thing. And so this is just asking how much does bumpiness go up with speed on this road segment and how much is the sort of level higher. And with this, we can measure effects for 8.2 million road segments covering 516,000 kilometers of roads across the United States. One slight problem is our Uber drivers go to lots of places within a metropolitan area. They don't necessarily go across metropolitan areas. And so you need to make an assumption, if you're going to compare across metropolitan areas, about what the distribution of fixed effects looks like in the two areas. And so we typically assume that the mean level across metropolitan areas is the same of the fixed effects. Okay. This is, for example, what we get for Cook County. So this is Chicago. Local roads are an average of 20 miles per hour. We fix this so since we have a slope, we then, to form a predicted level at each roadside thing, we plug in the speed. Okay, so we plug in a speed of 20 at local roads, 32 of arterials, and 48 of highways. And this is what the map of Chicago looks like. what I want you to take away from this is just it's a lot worse inside the city than it's on the edges. And not only that, it's pretty discontinuous. The roads get sharply better once you leave Chicago and go to wealthier suburbs like Evanston. We do a whole bunch of stuff because my co-author, Gabriel, is appropriately obsessive about getting data right to confirm that this is actually measuring stuff. And so this is for the places where we have both the Department of Transportation data and our data. This is looking at the correlations between the two, and it's about 50-something% correlation. We are able to do this for New York City. We have less of a correlation, but our measures actually predict speed. Their measures don't. And their measures are based on a visual index, which we think of as being distinctly inferior to an actual physical measure. We also show the correlation with railroad crossings and with road repaving, all of which sort of seem to suggest we're getting signal. Now, what we then try to do is estimate what's the actual cost of this. How much do drivers suffer by having crappy roads? And so this requires an economic model. And the idea behind this economic model is you can get a smooth ride anytime you want by just slowing down. Okay? Now, slowing down comes at a cost. Right? You're paying with extra time in order to get a smooth road. And in some sense, the ability to measure how much people slow down is a way of measuring how much they dislike bumpiness. And so we're going to do this by focusing on border discontinuities. We're also going to look at the impact of road repaving and other things. And the core idea of the math is, I went the wrong way, total costs are going to be something like a time cost, which is the value of time divided by the speed. So time spent is 1 over speed, so value of time over speed, plus this cost of bumpiness, plus some k of other speed costs. Okay, the first order condition gives you this first order condition. So this is the optimal level. You're going to set your time costs, time benefits of increasing speed against the cost of increasing roughness plus this extra term. And then you can use the envelope theorem, which tells you that the derivative of cost with respect to bumpiness equals the speed times b prime. Now, to get the intuition of this, just assume that this one doesn't exist right now. Then S prime times B star is also equal to V over gamma, and that's also going to come from the derivative of speed with respect to the bumpiness. Okay, so derivative of speed with respect to bumpiness essentially enables you to back this out. And so that's exactly what we're using. And the sort of intuition of this is we do everything locally, and then you sort of add up the changes to get you the integral under the demand for smoothness. And so this is what the jumps look like. So the jumps are really stark at different borders. You have sort of at the Evanston border, this is the overall Chicago, you have a big jump down in smoothness, big jump down in roughness when you leave Chicago, big jump up in speeds. We then plug this in. This is using just all towns. This is using the border, so this is within 500 meters of a border. This is using Chicago just after road repaving, and this is using the railway crossings. And they're all giving you slightly different coefficients. I think my preferred one is this one, but you can do others. And using this gives you the cost of driving that's implied by this. So median roughness has a cost of about 31 cents a mile. You can see the cost without roughness is about 80 cents. This comes from time and other stuff. And so this is not just, and just to highlight, this is not just the cost is not the time delay. The cost is the total cost of roughness that's implied by the model, that's implied by the fact that by your willingness to pay for this. One standard deviation higher road roughness is about 23 cents a mile. And the costs are higher if you use the road resurfacing data. Okay, so I'm now going to show you some facts, and we're going to finish up I'm going to give you sort of 2 facts, one of which is going to be about patterns of inequality of sort of road roughness, so which areas have worse roads, which areas have better roads, and then I'm just going to show you a fact about maintenance. So the facts on inequality are, unsurprisingly, poorer areas have worse roads, and areas with more African Americans have worse roads. And so as you go from a 100% white neighborhood to a 100% African American neighborhood, that's associated with $456 per year in added pain to the drivers. Now, I want to stress this added pain is not necessarily like the whole social cost, because there actually are some social benefits from driving slower, like you're less likely to engage in accidents, which is why communities sometimes introduce road roughness in the form of speed bumps on their own. But the cost to the drivers is $456 a year. Now, as you can see by comparing regression 4 and regression 6, 85% of that is across town, not within town. So it's not that New York and Chicago have worse roads in areas with more African Americans. It's that African Americans are more likely to live in cities with worse roads than whites live. in. There's also a difference in income. About 2/3 of the income difference disappears when you look just within towns. And that's the difference between 2 and 3 or between 5 and 6. That's showing you the within town versus across town. Now, within some big towns, you can see some interesting patterns. So in fact, New York City, which is a not unfamiliar pattern for big cities, actually, the worst roads are the places where the richest people live. So Tribeca, which is sort of at the very center down here, this is terrible roads. Partially it's because you just get a lot of truck traffic and trucks eat up roads. In Chicago, there are two main centers of African-American populations here, which is the South Side, which is actually where I learned how to drive when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, which has really quite smooth roads in our data, and I can confirm, like there were no potholes when I was driving around Chicago in the early 1990s. And over here, this is the West Side. West Side's got terrible roads. Right? And so that's an area that's much more industrial. And so these two different areas have just a very different road experience. In general, the bigger the town, the flatter the income gradient is, the flatter the race gradient is. So in small towns, in small white towns, there's a much sharper race gradient, and there's a much sharper income gradient. In large cities, it's flattening out, and that's what you're seeing here. And in a purely statistical sense, road expenditure alone does not explain why some towns are smoother than others. Okay, so you control for road expenditure. Actually, the towns with worse roads actually spend a little bit more. It does nothing to explain the differences across towns that go with race or income. This is sort of a parallel fact to the fact that none of the difference in school quality appears to be associated with just spending more money on schools. Now, again, this is biased by the fact that if you have worse schools, you have worse roads, maybe intrinsically you need to spend more, but it doesn't in a purely correlational sense explain anything. And this is my last fact, and then I will just end on making some general observations, which is this is the relationship between the roughness of the road and its subsequent probability of being repaved. And this is, in some sense, the biggest fact of the paper, which is in 8 out of the 11 cities where we have data, there is zero correlation between road roughness and subsequent repair. Okay? These cities are repaving the smoothest roads with exactly the same probability that they are repaving the roughest roads. New York, they're repaving somewhat more, but not like what you'd expect from an algorithm that says repave the roughest roads first. I mean, they're repaving like at double the rate. Now, I don't know, maybe they shouldn't be repaving all those roads, but why are they repaving the smoothest roads at all? And yet they are. And you see in many cases basically no change in smoothness from this repaving. And so my answer to sort of how America can get better roads is just repave the rougher roads first. Okay, that's my lesson on this. And I often take this as sort of a larger lesson for our governments doing more complicated things. Like so, I engaged in a debate on industrial policy last summer, and industrial policy is a complex thing where you're trying to pick winners and losers. A country that cannot figure out how to repave rougher roads is not a country that can be trusted to figure out which industries it should invest in over the next 20 years to engage in industrial magic. Okay, let me end. You had a long day, and I want to end by making sort of a final observations, which is I often think of cities as resting on a triad, on a three-legged stool. Okay, the first leg of this are the economic interactions that make magic in urban areas. Right, it's the fact that then symbolized by the old city of Jerusalem, where you see people coming together to work together, to learn from one another, to buy, to sell, to employ one another. All the things that cities do that are sort of economically magical, they're culturally magical, that do amazing things. Right below it, and this is an image from the marathon bombing in Boston from about 15 years ago, there are also demons that come with density. If two people are close enough to exchange an idea face-to-face, they're also close enough to exchange a virus. Cities are the ports of entry on our global lattice of travel and trade. They are the ports of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, and for viruses. Okay, and so high crime in cities is a long-standing feature in many areas. If someone's close enough to sell you a newspaper, they're close enough to rob you. Okay, high housing costs, traffic congestion, again, all of these things are intimately related to density, and they're why, in fact, why cities need government, right? They're why there's a complementarity between the quality of the public sector and the cities. I often argue that an abundance of land hides many sins, but the failures of government become completely obvious when you're cramming people together in a close area. Third, there is the physical city. It is a long-standing claim of social scientists and others that the real city is made out of flesh and blood, not steel and concrete, right? The real city is human capital, not physical capital, right? I'm echoing, Shakespeare, who said, "What is the city but the people?" Who in his turn was echoing Thucydides, who wrote 2,400 years ago that a city is not its walls and ships, but its men, okay? And, it remains true. But the infrastructure still matters. The building still matters. The rules that we put that make it difficult to deliver high-density housing in places still matters. And when I think about the sort of future of African cities, all three of these elements are important. Okay, much of my own work has focused in Africa on the downsides of density, on the water side in particular, and also on these difficulties of trusting people in areas. But the physical city is also incredibly important. And I think in terms of South Africa, this is both about the sort of regulation of the formal sector, and also whatever you're going to do for the informal housing sector. And I will just end by saying this, like again, where I was beginning of thinking about sort of the right level of government intervention. That in fact, you may want something. There is a tendency of some countries to want to have regulations that seem appropriate for, I don't know, Denmark. And if you're going to have a country that's a relatively poor country that has regulations that go with Denmark, you're going to get a huge amount of informality, right? Which is not intrinsically a terrible thing. There's a lot to love about informality. There's a lot to love about the energy that comes from informal entrepreneurship. But if you're really expecting all of this stuff to be in a legally, unfettered zone, then bad things can also happen. And sort of thinking about what are the appropriate institutions in a given setting seems really important. And I will just end on this by again sort of echoing what I said at the beginning, which is the right answer when you see the downsides of cities is never to say, like, I just wish people would stop coming. It's to say, how can we make this better? How can we figure out whatever in combination of institutions and infrastructure and incentives that can actually make these cities more humane, more functional, more livable? And solving those problems, I'm an old man, none of you are, solving those problems is it's an amazing vocation for a lifetime. I've spent my life studying the cities of the world, and it's been a tremendously rewarding thing for me. And I hope some of you decide that it's something that's worthwhile doing with your lifetime as well. So thank you. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So I'm sorry, I went a little over on this. Well, this one says, they say different times. Ollie, just yeah. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. This is very inspiring presentation. Since you have a very rich experience in Africa as well, maybe have you observed any policy-driven or policy-induced segregation between the rich and the poor in Africa? Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're in South Africa, right? I mean, the legacy of policy-driven segregation is everywhere around us in here. I think the harder question is, what do you do about it when it exists, right? So, I mean, apartheid was this horrendous legal exercise, which also variants of it occurred in the U.S. as well, of artificially separating people and ensuring that one group of people, because of their color of their skin, didn't get to enjoy the benefits of urban interaction. But the hard part is, what do you do? And it's a problem we face in the U.S. as well. What do you do to sort of undo that? And it's not at all obvious what you do to undo that. There are the housing vouchers experiments that, the moving to opportunity that were done by the Department of Housing and Urban Development 35 years in the U.S. were one example. But that's an incredibly expensive intervention for an African context. And so, I think I would, I think about what are the things that are barriers in the workplace to hiring people who come with less, and sort of that tends to push me towards having fewer sort of labor market regulations that make it very unattractive to hiring less skilled people, and making sure that you have more on-ways from that. Figuring out how to sort of build more housing that not necessarily subsidized, but figuring out how to get rid of the rules that make it more difficult to build housing for poor people in places that are proximate to richer people. That would feel like a desirable thing to do done. But I don't have a magic bullet here, but I do know it's sort of an important thing, and undoing, figuring out how to make Africa's cities of inclusion and cities of connection for all feels like it's a very central part of the objective. Thank you for the question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a similar point. You said one of your big principles was act as a private developer, but owned by the sort of MPO.
It's a framework.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem as a South African is this issue of segregation, right? Because you do want to touch the waterfront in the sense that you want neighborhood mixing. This issue of segregation has a lot of negative impacts. So just to sort of push back on that. But I also wanted to ask you...
Think about how expensive it is. Think about what it is that you're doing and what else you could do with the money that you're spending on integrating it, right? And you better be really sure that if you're going to build public housing right in the midst of like your prime area, that the money that you're sacrificing by doing that couldn't be used on, early childhood interventions in the townships that have 50 times more impact. Okay, so again, if you can look at it from, but and I'm sort of highlighting, I'm not backing up one single inch on what I said earlier, because it is true that integration and connection is an objective, but you better actually make sure that you're balancing the needs of the private developer, which means they need to be clearly thought about with whatever you're trying to do in poverty alleviation.
Sure. And my follow-up was the throwaway you made about public procurement, which is really interesting. I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on some research questions. In our own context in South Africa, we have quite a sophisticated version of regulating that, and yet corruption is so widespread. In practice, it seems that there's a huge cost, and yet it just never seems to deliver the value despite the checks and balances. And I wondered, some thinking about public procurement and research. Thanks.
That's great. That's a great. I mean, I'm so glad that someone was interested in my throwaway question on this. Our fact in our AER paper on public procurement around the world is that you want to think about procurement as being regulated. And the regulation of public entities is fundamentally different conceptually than the regulation of private entities, where you're sort of weighing off, internalizing some kind of externalities with avoiding, limiting individual freedom. In the case of the public entity, you're typically trying to reduce through regulation the sort of abuse of corruption, typically. But the downside is you're making them non-nimble. You're making them difficult to make it difficult to respond. We typically find that in relatively poor or lower human capital countries or countries with less public effectiveness, that actually regulation tends to be beneficial. I mean, the overall level of performance tends to be relatively low, but the downside of non-regulation is just more and more corruption. So in well-functioning countries, you actually shouldn't regulate, right? It's much better off in the places that are sort of the top performers in Singapore, in Norway, right? These guys hire good people, they give them relatively good incentives for performance, and then they tell them to figure it out, which is what you would do if you had a well-functioning private organization. Is you wouldn't say, here's your rule book, you've got to follow 800 of them. You'd hire a good person and tell them to be sensible about it. So I don't know that I know the right answer, but I do know that South Africa is in a difficult place on this, whereas you can't just say get rid of the regulation. Although you could perhaps be asking what types of regulation could be reduced without causing huge amounts of problem. And certainly the history of the U.S. is one in which the early regulations, let's say in New York after the Tweed scandal of the 1870s, were by and large benevolent. Every new wave of corruption, they created more rules, even though the subsequent corruption was already illegal under the old rules. And yet they threw in another whole set of rules, which clearly would have done, had nothing to do with the problem. And so I think it's sort of important taking it on a case-by-case basis and thinking about each regulation in and of itself. But it's always about this trade-off between creating some form of nimbleness and creating some sort of limitations. I think this also relates to, I'll give you this framework, which is and now I really do have to end, but there are two ways of dealing with the sort of, corruption in government, corruption in municipal government. One of which is following the British path, which is you have a civil service or some form of a thing for doing water entities or other things like that, where you've divorced it from politics and you're sort of creating something that's super, independent. That's the British way. The downside is like these independent parastatal entities have no ultimately accountability to anybody. And if there's sort of my general rule is if you can't hire someone with a global reputation to run one of these things, you're better off following the American path, which is you bring it all in-house. Right? You bring it all in-house, so the mayor has responsibility, the mayor owns the problem, and you can fire the mayor, meaning the voters can fire the mayor if the mayor doesn't deliver. And so that's the American model. And it's not obvious that one is better than the other. I mean, the American model always will lead to some politicization of this public services. You never get rid of that, but at least you know who to fire. And whereas in the independent public entity thing, it just goes on. So I think that's also sort of related to this, and I think it's also, at least when I think about Johannesburg and reform for Johannesburg, I think thinking that you're actually going to get a case in which all of like the water and the electricity company are all these independent, highly functional entities that have been depoliticized, that feels utterly implausible to me. Whereas I sort of think it's plausible for you. Imagine that you have some hard-driving mayoral candidate who says, I'm running on a platform of like your water's going to work and your electricity is going to work, and if I don't deliver it in 2 years, you can fire me. And that's sort of a plausible model for reform. Last comment I will make on politics and government. I have another mantra on city government, which is that capacity trumps policy. And as economists, as social scientists, we're taught to come up with good policy ideas. But the problem is you walk into a mayor's office and you have 87 great policy ideas, and the mayor's only got 3 people who will do anything that she wants them to do. Okay? And consequently, because you haven't thought about the limitations on what the mayor is capable of doing, the mayor is not going to be able to deliver whatever it is you have in mind. Now, there's heterogeneity. Cape Town is actually a city with an enormous amount of public capacity relative to most cities, and I include American cities in this. I mean, Cape Town is an incredibly well-functioning place in terms of capacity, but that's not true of, many cities throughout the world, even very rich and powerful ones. And sort of think about, how your idea goes together with like the mayor's ability to deliver. Last point I will make on this. So I've been working on a paper of reform of the Doing Business Index over the last 25 years. And in many places, there have been things that have gotten a lot better. Starting a business in lots of places has gotten a lot easier. Paying your taxes as a business has gotten a lot easier. Labor market regulations, not so much. Okay, it turns out where you see the improvements are in cases in which you can make changes that are either administrative or technical, right? Meaning you can file your taxes online. And so again, this relates to capacity. Okay, anything that requires a law, give up, right? But things that in fact the leader can do on their own, right? Because it requires much less effort and the capacity can work it, that's reform that works. And so again, being aware of the functional limitations of the government entity and what they can actually do is absolutely critical. Again, thank you very, very much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you later.
Thank you, Prof. Glaeser.